Good afternoon. Today is Monday, the 16th of September, 2024, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. Delighted to have with me Diane, Rasmussen, McAdie, who will be speaking from Scotland, and Ben Rubin, who will be joining us from London. Well, probably the first thing to say is we're going to feature Ukraine today. Huge amount going on around Ukraine, through Ukraine, but at the end of the day, a really appalling war with gross slaughter. But this appears to be one conflict that the West wants to keep going for as long as possible. So it shouldn't surprise us that we've seen a huge amount in the press about the West providing more weapons, in particular missiles and storm shadows. But of course, if anybody else wants to bring their missiles in, Iran, for instance, where it's been rumoured that ballistic missiles have been transferred to the Russians, well, it's Western weapons good, Eastern weapons bad. But there can be no doubt that British politicians are desperate to escalate this war. And I'll just say to our viewers that on Friday's news edition with Mike Robinson, there was some really detailed information about what had been reported around Ukraine, and you can see this on the show notes from the UK Column website, but I've posted some of them on screen just so that world viewers of UK Column can get some idea of the detail. And of course the timestamps also go with this. So if you haven't seen Friday's news, I'd encourage you to go back and have a look at this. But let's start by featuring Admiral Bauer, who is the Dutch admiral who's in charge, the chairman of the NATO Military Committee. Let's hear his message about the wonders of Ukraine.
The NATO Military Committee is honored to have been so warmly received despite the heavy rains in the beautiful Czech Republic. We're grateful to our hosts for bringing us here together at such a crucial time for our alliance. Today, the NATO military authorities discussed the two Herculean tasks that we need to undertake simultaneously. While continuing and ramping up our support to Ukraine, we must also bolster our own deterrence and defense. Over the past year, we have made huge strides in making NATO's new defense plans fully executable. NATO now has 500,000 troops on high readiness. We established the Allied Reaction Force. We are adapting our command and control structure, and allies are rapidly developing and expanding their capabilities. Training and exercises play a key role in that. This year, the alliance held its largest collective defense exercise since the Cold War, Steadfast Defender. Over 90,000 troops from across the alliance exercised in Germany, Poland, and the 3 Baltic states. This demonstrates that a new era of collective defense is upon us, and NATO is stronger and readier than ever. But the responsibility for freedom does not rest on the shoulders of those in uniform alone. Today, the chiefs of defense discussed the fact that strong deterrence requires strong societal resilience. It requires a whole-of-society approach with a keen role for the private sector. Not only our defense industries, but our whole economies need to realize that peace is no longer a given.
So an amazing statement there. Some of this is pure theatre, of course, because at the moment everything points to the fact that NATO is in a complete shambles, and this is why defence plans have got to be gripped. We can't produce enough ammunition. NATO stocks run out in some countries, all as a result of the attempts to prop up Ukraine. But what does he say to us? Well, you can expect war and more war to the extent that it's going to absorb the whole of Western societies. I believe this man plan and his committee are extremely dangerous because nobody is talking about stopping the war in Ukraine. But maybe it gets worse because, let's pop this one on screen, we've got the Kiev Independent here. Zelensky to present the US with a victory plan in September. Things not going well for Ukraine in the war, but we are to believe that Zelensky and his team have come up with a victory plan. That's got to be presented to the Americans, because without the Americans there will be no victory for Ukraine. If we take a look here at another article, it gets interesting because there's been a big spat recently because it was suggested that Zelensky might actually accept a ceasefire on certain sections of the front, but this has been refuted in the Kiev Independent and here with Ukraine Pravda. Basically, Zelensky's communication advisor, Dmytro Litvin, has said that this was a fake story and that Bild, the German newspaper, hadn't seen the plan and what had been reported was complete nonsense. He goes on to say that nobody will give the Russians Minsk III or any other format. Ukraine opposes any freezing of the war, and this stance is communicated by Ukrainian authorities at all levels. The victory plan will be presented to the United States first because the United States can ensure the implementation of its content. They are desperate to have the Americans on board because without the Americans, Ukraine will no longer be fighting this war. Now, if we have a look at the Kiev Post, so this is all giving us a flavour of what's in the Ukrainian minds. The Kiev Post is using the Institute for the Study of War maps and analysis. And effectively, therefore, the Kiev Post is using this material alongside the BBC and the UK's Ministry of Defence to regurgitate their analysis. And the Institute for the Study of War themselves are also quoting military bloggers now. They're so desperate to understand what's happening on the front, they're using military bloggers. We've talked about the Institute before, but let's remind ourselves about the mission and what it has to say. It says the Institute for the Study of War advances an informed understanding of military affairs through reliable research, trusted analysis, and innovative education. We are committed to improving the nation's ability to execute military operations. They're talking about the US, and respond to emerging threats in order to, quote, achieve US strategic objectives. So this organization is all about US objectives, yet it tries to say that it's non-partisan. This is complete nonsense. Now, over the weekend, I came across this report from August, which is the Institute of War, talking about problems of restoring maneuver in the contemporary war of Ukraine. What it's really saying is the Ukrainians are losing and they don't know how to deal with it. And it says that the United States and its allies and partners must understand and internalize the lessons of this war. So this is a battlefield laboratory, but the one thing this document does not talk about, apart from the odd word and certainly no numbers, is the casualty. But this is a battlefield laboratory which is a benefit not to the Ukrainians, but to the US, the UK, and the West. And here's the reality. It states that the Russians have gone over to the offensive along the entire line and appear intent on continuing offensive operations indefinitely. But of course, we've been told over weeks and months, and indeed years, that the Russians had or were going to run out of shells, and they were to lose to the wonder weapons of the Leopard, Challenger and Abrams tanks, and of course the F-16s. None of this has happened, all complete nonsense and propaganda for the Western public. What it does go on to say is that Ukraine faces enormous challenges today and in the months to come, and they're unlikely to be able to initiate significant counter-offensive operations in 2024 and into 2025. So a Russian offensive at the moment has parallels paralysed operations by the Ukrainians. But what does it go on to say? This should be a time of experimentation that should increasingly let Ukraine challenge Russian forces for the initiative in parts of the theatre while exploring opportunities for future more substantial counteroffensive operations. And of course, as the West experiments, Ukrainian troops die. Now, here's one of the maps from the Institute for the Study of War. And of course, what this is showing us is this institute, which is very powerful in the West, in UK, with the BBC and the UK Ministry of Defence. This is pushing for the use of long-range weapons, and it's showing you by the red marker pins where Russian targets are that can be reached by these new weapons. So this organisation is pushing extremely hard for these weapons to be used as part of the experimentation on the battlefield. And in this diagram, you can see how close these attacks can move to Moscow. So my question is, what would the West's outcry be if the Russian attacks were themselves taking place within 100 miles of London? But a lot of detail in these particular maps, and all of them are actually pushing for these weapons to be unleashed on Russian sovereign territory in order to keep the Ukrainian war going and the battlefield laboratory operating. It goes on here to say categorically that the West must provide Ukraine with long-range strike systems and the full permission to use them. And it also talks about missiles and drones, because essentially these things have to be used hand in glove. So this is one organisation highly influential in UK and the US, pushing for the use of these long-range weapons into Russia. And I'm going to restate that when you look at this report, there is absolutely no mention of circa 400,000 Ukrainian and 100,000 Russian dead. They don't feature because this is a battlefield laboratory for the West, and the fighting must continue for experimentation reasons until the last Ukrainian. Here's part of the conclusion. It says that helping Ukraine accomplish its task is vital for Ukraine's supporters as well. Unlocking the secrets, here's the detail, unlocking the secrets of effective warfare in the modern era will point the way for the future development of the war-fighting capabilities of the United States and its allies and partners around the world. So this is really sickening stuff, that the violence and the killing is to go on in Ukraine simply because the West's military-industrial complex can benefit and learn for future conflicts. Now, to do to carry out such a callous agenda, you need callous politicians. So let's bring one of Britain's finest on screen.
Keir Starmer has pledged £3 billion in aid to Ukraine that they can use for military use. That is more money, speed it up. They have asked for further missiles. We have provided them. We are in discussion with them about ensuring that they get through the winter in the strongest of position. As for Putin,
but they're not going to get through the winter if they're being rained down.
Putin said
Russian missiles from Iran
don't send,
raining down on them from Russian bases.
Putin said don't send tanks. We sent them. Putin said don't send any missiles. We sent them. Putin threatens every few months to use nuclear weapons. It's totally unaccepted. We won't be bullied by Putin's shameless grandstanding. What he should now do is cease his aggression and leave Ukraine. That's what he should do.
So some people in the UK column chat box, as we deliver this news, are calling this man a clown. Well, he may be a clown, but ultimately he's extremely arrogant, very, very dangerous. And ultimately it's beholden on the public of UK to bring this man to account. But this is the quality of politician under Keir Starmer, calling for direct attacks on Russian soil And what will the Russian reaction be? Well, they've indicated in kind. So very, very dangerous. But if that's Lammy, let's bring our old friend Boris Johnson back on screen.
Mr. Johnson, do you have a message for Germany, for Chancellor Scholz? Do you think it's time for the long-range missiles coming from Germany?
I think that Olaf has done extraordinary things already, but I do think that the towers needs to be deployed, and I hope very much that the German government will do that. But I also, I think we all need to do more, and that includes the United Kingdom, the United States, France. We all need to do more together, but I'm sure we will.
How important are the U.S. elections for this war? Trump,
well,
Harris.
as I said just now, I hope very much that America will continue with the policy of supporting Ukraine, whoever is the president.
Thank you so much, Mr. Johnson.
So Boris Johnson there joyfully calling for the German equivalent of Storm Shadow to be unleashed on Russia. And these are quotes from him. It's heartbreaking to visit wounded veterans in recovery centres in Kiev this weekend. But he goes on to say that some of these casualties could have been avoided if we had given Storm Shadow permissions earlier. So use of these weapons could have save lives, and this is another part of one of his quotes. There's no conceivable case for delay. The only person who fears escalation is Vladimir Putin, and every day that goes by is a lost opportunity to save lives and bring about a just conclusion to this war. This is the state of this man, jaded politician and now so-called media star. But just to end this segment, of course, the events around Trump over the weekend, well, yesterday, in fact, the BBC on the case, what we know about the Trump attack and the suspect. Of course, remember that for whatever his faults, Trump has said that if he's elected, he will put an end to the war in Ukraine. But here's the BBC, Ross Atkins, analysis editor under BBC Verify, really, to my mind, gloating about the event and getting very excited because he's discovered that Ryan Ruth, who's the man accused of being there ready to assassinate Trump, was at one stage recruiting soldiers for Ukraine. So the BBC getting very excited, but of course, if we go back, it was the BBC themselves here in March 2022 who were promoting mercenaries, people going to fight for money in Ukraine, those people being the guardians of democracy, humanity and heritage. Sickening hypocrisy by the BBC, and of course, not one word of peace in Ukraine, certainly not in the form of a cessation to hostilities. Diane, welcome to the news today. This is the world we live in, but these same people, many people would say psychopaths, sociopaths, have got plans for the globe as a whole. What can you tell us?
Thanks, Brian, and hello, Ben. It's good to be here today. Yeah, I have a globalist report that hopefully will kind of situate some of these things for you, including just a bit about Ukraine, which will come later on in the segment. So for those of you who are going to be in New York for the next week or so, starting this weekend, the 79th session of the United Nations General Assembly is happening. So in case you wanted to pop into some of their meetings, they'll be right there for you. And Debbie Evans has covered earlier this year in her blog and on the news, the Summit of the Future, which is a specific high-level event which will be happening as part of, or sort of, I think, before the General Assembly takes place. And what is the Summit of the Future? Well, you can go back and look at Debbie's reports, but ultimately what it says is they are going to be working on a pact for the future to chart a path toward achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, or as I call them, unsustainable, and responding to emerging challenges and opportunities, which will include a global digital compact and a declaration on future generations as annexes. So there are 5 key themes for the pact. Some of these should start to sound familiar to you. The one at the top is sustainable development, which is the one I'm going to go into. International peace and security, science, technology, innovation, youth and future generations, and transforming global governance. So just as a review, Sustainable Development Goal 13 is what they call climate action at the UN and other related organizations. Here at the UK column, I call it You Will Not Breathe, because this is all about what they are going to do to us and the impact it will have on us. So I want to go back into history and also bring us back into the future, just to kind of show where some of this a little bit of globalism, a little bit of sustainable development, and to raise some potential possibilities that I see in some of the research I've been doing around this recently. So if any of you were around in 1972 and remember, there was a bestseller by the Club of Rome called The Limits to Growth. And the Club of Rome was started in 1972 was when this was published. But in 1968, Dr. Aurelio Pachai, who was one of the three co-founders of the Club of Rome, got 30 people together in Rome to discuss what he called the present and future predicament of man. Now, the three founders of the Club of Rome were a philanthropist, which was Dr. Aurelio Pachai, a chemist, and a banker. The banker was David Rockefeller. And so, of course, with a chemist, a banker, and a philanthropist all together, what could possibly go wrong, right? Well, we have the Club of Rome as a result. And so that was published in 1972. So now I want to go into someone who I don't believe has been covered on the column recently or at all, as far as I can tell, may have been, but this is someone that I found out about from a new friend of mine that I met at the Academies of Ideas conference that I went to a few weeks ago. And his name is Dr. Paul Raskin. Dr. Paul Raskin got a PhD in 1970 in theoretical physics from Columbia University. His thesis was high energy particle potentials and their application to the scattering of particles off nuclei. Now, you might wonder what that has to do with sustainable development, but I'm wondering if I haven't been able to read his thesis, but I'm wondering what happened between 1970 and 1976. 1972, the Club of Rome report was published. 1976, Dr. Raskin founded the Energy Systems Research Group, ESRG. In 1980, he was part of a report that was sent to U.S. Congress called New England Can Reduce Its Oil Dependence Through Conservation and Renewable Resource Development. In 1990, ESRG became renamed as the Callous Institute. And according to the website, they have conducted over 3,500 projects throughout the world, becoming internationally recognized in sustainable development. And that's since 1976. When they remember that Callous, which was something that I think is interesting, and remember this for later, Callous is also the word in Roman mythology for Mother Earth. So it's basically a sort of a Gaia, a Earth worshipping kind of elements to that name. In 1995, he convened the Global Scenario Group to explore the requirements for a transition to a sustainable and just global civilization. And as of 2024, he is still alive, and the Callous Institute is now embarked in a new phase, reframing our programs around the larger mission of advancing a just and sustainable planetary civilization. So I believe we have a video here of a bit of an interview with Dr. Raskin. If we can play that, please.
When we discuss scenarios, we talk about three broad channels radiating out into the future. One we call conventional worlds, basically an evolutionary sequence of events despite hiccups like the current meltdown, that the basic paradigm and values persist into the future. The second channel is barbarization, in which markets and policies are unable to cope with the crises, and the chaos and the social disruption and the environmental deterioration that is induced by conventional worlds. And you have futures of catastrophic disruption. And the third we call great transitions, where people rise to the possibilities, to the promise of this planetary phase with new values and new institutions, and development steers towards a more fortunate form of civilization.
So we have here a slide that just kind of shows, this is also on their website, The Great Transition, which is a project of the Callous Institute and colleagues. So basically saying that trends and forces that are going on in the world lead to these potential three scenarios. So the scenarios are basically things that could happen. We could kind of stay on track to where we are. We could fall into barbarization where everything falls apart and everyone's poor and hungry. Or we could have these wonderful great transitions, which I believe are related to Marxism, as we'll see next. I won't go into a lot of detail. All of these things are in the show notes if you really want to go into the detail. I've done it so you don't have to, fortunately for the rest of you. But basically, they're pushing the line of equity to show that the great transitions scenario that they have come up with will be the most equitable, which of course, equity, as a reminder from last week from Ben Rubin, saying woke Marxism, equity means we all end up in the same place, which means that we will no longer have wealth. They're trying to do away with capitalism and replace it with communism, which I've found a lot of evidence for as I've gone through this. In the Great Transition 2002 document that they wrote, again, these are all online, freely available. We had the takeoff of the planetary transition from 1980 to 2000, when we had all this climate change, the advent of the internet, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and so on. And you can see from 2000 to 2050, by the time we get to 2050, we've already had the transition. So according to them, we're in the middle of this transition as we're going through it right now. Dr. Raskin published a book called Journey to Earthland, and this and the other publications were published by the Stockholm Environment Institute, which is a research institute that tackles these environmental challenges. So obviously they're all over the World Economic Forum website, and they have locations throughout the world. One is in New York, one is in Oxford, in case you want to stop by and say hello. They worked together with the Callous Institute for several years, and you can see a lot of evidence that throughout all of this documentation as well. So there's a copy of Journey to Earthland, where he says that Marx said that people make their own history, but not as they please. Historical necessity curbs human freedom. So that's an important point to remember for later. And we see further on in the Great Transition documents, we see a couple of papers directly quoting Marxism and ecology. And these papers point out that Marx's theory was ecological sustainability, came from Marx, which says this is the crisis of the earth, which needs to lead us from capitalism to communism. And that is central to his view of communism taking place, replacing capitalism, essentially. So where does that take us to from here? Now we look at, we have on the United Nations, where they cited Dr. Raskin's work in 2018, the role of civil society in advancing global citizenship, and just to show that, that his work is being used, even though we may not necessarily know who he is specifically, but his work is very influential. So coming back to 2022 and back to the Club of Rome again, we see in this book, Earth for All, which is a 50-year update to the publication that they started 50 years ago. So Earth for All uses the limits to growth and planetary boundaries framework. So planetary boundaries were something that came up during the work in the past with the Great Transition and colleagues that worked directly with Dr. Raskin, and we can see this in the document. So let's see a little bit of a video clip, parts of a video from the Club of Rome, who does, by the way, have a YouTube channel, and see what some of the authors from the Club of Rome said about this work.
We are proposing 5 turnarounds paid for by the 10% richest people in the world.
If we put in place the 5 turnarounds that we talk about, the focusing on inequality, the focus on poverty, the focus on empowerment, and then food and energy as the 2 key resources that will keep us alive as we're faced with some of these ongoing crises, then we actually could get ourselves out of this mess.
And the interesting thing with these 5 turnarounds is that they can be scaled from communities to cities to sectors, nations, regions, and then globally. So that's what we were looking for, like a fractal set of fractals that escalate or percolate down from the global economic system all the way down.
I'm absolutely convinced that the Ukraine war will help us to accelerate the transition away from oil, coal, and natural gas.
So we could see an energy democracy where local sources, microgrids, local areas don't have to rely so much on the global fossil energy system.
What we're facing is not an environmental crisis. It's a crisis of security, of stability, of prosperity and equity. And that's what Earth for All really brings forward.
So what they're trying to do with Earth for All, as they're doing, and I've read the book, most of it, so you don't have to. You certainly can if you want to, is a couple of important things that come out of it. Again, the tie with Ukraine, saying that the war will help us to accelerate the transition away from oil, coal, and natural gas. The last man who was speaking there was Johan Rockström. He is previously with the Stockholm Environmental Institute, as well as the Stockholm Resilience Center, which were previously partnered and published the works of the Callous Institute, as well as, he's all these people are involved in the Club of Rome. Sandrine Dixon, who was in the video, she was wearing her little Sustainable Development Goals badge very proudly. She is the co-president of the Club of Rome. And again, another important point to come out of this is that this will all be paid for by the richest 10%, which they will do by taxing higher income people and just redistributing it. So again, we see the trend towards Marxism there. It's also important to note that the whole system transformation is very important to all of this. It's not just about the climate anymore. It's not just about it's too hot or too cold or whatever. It is a whole system transformation, which includes things like gender equity, which is also in this book. So again, the end of gender, saying that basically they're going to control the population by allowing women to get more education, and therefore we will have a richer economy, which they believe therefore leads to people having fewer children. So that's the plan leading up to 2100 and how they plan to look at this population control issue. So back to the Summit of the Future, we look at the Earth for All website. So it has been restylized. It's very nice and trendy now. It has the number 4 instead of the word 4 compared to the original book. We have the nice, colorful, bright, sustainable development goals, making us feel all happy. And they have said on the 4th of September that in advance of the Summit of the Future, they have released a new report detailing 2 possible futures for sub-Saharan Africa this century. So again, they're going back to this scenario development. And instead of having things like barbarization, great transition, and conventional worlds, we now have 2 scenarios. One is called Too Little, Too Late, which is if we just kind of talk slightly about sustainability and don't really do much, we're going to be in trouble, from their point of view. The other one is the Giant Leap, in which they particularly mention universal basic income as something coming in if the Giant Leap scenario, which is of course the one they want, comes into place. That's the decrease of women having fewer babies, the population going down. And at the end of the book, it talks about valuing equality, diversity, and inclusion, and saying that is the start to valuing our future and where we need to go from here to make all of these things more equitable and just and sustainable. So what's happening in the next few days at the Summit of the Future? The Club of Rome has 3 events that they are hosting. One is the Intergenerational Leadership for Innovation and Sustainability on the 20th. On the 21st, we will be exploring proposals from the Wales Protocol for future generations and how they can build into kind of the future generations declaration that they're building. And on the 22nd of September, the high point is the high-level roundtable on equity and planetary stability featuring Sir Richard Branson himself. So we can see high-profile people going on there at the UN. And I just want to end this by asking a quick question, which is, why are we doing this? And so I want to go back to King Charles and the Terra Carta, which was part of his Sustainable Markets Initiative. And, in 2020 in Davos, he introduced the Sustainable Markets Initiative, which was a proposed set of principles leading up to 2030 that puts nature, people, and planet at the heart of global value creation. So I think there's woke Marxism going on. I think there's obviously a major financial implication here because I think King Charles just got a £45 million raise, I believe. I certainly didn't get that much of a raise. And the earth worship, I think, is an important thing to keep track of. The Tellus, the people and planet and environment and nature all being together in harmony. Really that destruction of civilization that the West, the Christian views that some people have in the West, I think they're trying to do away with this by putting this into play. So those are just my thoughts. Those are just questions, Brian. I don't know what you think.
Thank you very much for that, Diane. Well, as we've seen the quality of the politicians, wherever they are, UK or overseas, I don't think they should be allowed to drive such an agenda. But when the gentleman said that the Ukraine war was good for this transformative change for the future, I've got to say my blood went cold. Ben, let's bring you in because Amnesty is an organisation that supposedly stands up for the underdog worldwide. What have you been discovering?
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Diane. Hello, everybody. Great to be here, as ever. I've got a bit of an update. So we've been doing some reporting on the Walthamstow protest and a letter that I sent to Amnesty UK Chief Executive Sasha Deshmukh, and I finally got a response. It came through on Friday, and I'm going to report on that and let you know what they come back to me with. Just to refresh everyone's memory, it was particularly related to this comment by former Labour councillor Ricky Jones.
They are disgusting, nasty bastards, and we need to cull their fruits and get rid of them all.
So, as we've reported on the show before, Ricky Jones was arrested, he's been charged, and he's going to court in January. But at the time, I noticed the individual stood next to Jones in the video wearing an Amnesty International high-vis vest. You can see here with a little red arrow pointing towards her. And I sent a message to Sasha Deshmukh, which you can read on my Substack, riseuk.substack.com. There's Sasha, he's the chief executive of Amnesty UK. Just a query, essentially, how it was that someone who apparently works for his organisation could be out on the street, essentially applauding a statement like that. As Brian said in the introduction there, Amnesty is supposed to stand up against tyranny, but here we can see Amnesty, unfortunately, standing alongside it. Now, I'm just going to read you a couple of pieces from the letter that I sent. You can, as I say, you can go and see this. It's on my Substack. It was sent on the 13th of August. And essentially, I said here to Sasha, it's hard to overstate the danger of the road this kind of rhetoric will take us down if allowed to continue. The potential for extreme violence across the UK has never been greater. The tone of public discourse must de-escalate and remain peaceful, else we risk serious harms being inflicted on the population, and not least by other members of the population. What do I mean by that? It leads to places like this. This is from the S21 torture chamber in Phnom Penh. This was done under the Khmer Rouge. I'm not going to labour the point. I've talked about it quite a lot recently, but this is the kind of thing that happens on the back of that kind of rhetoric. And we need organisations like Amnesty to come through and begin denouncing this. So my questions to Sasha, as I sent through to him, were as follows. Do you and Amnesty condemn those statements made by Ricky Jones? Can you confirm whether the woman in the video wearing the Amnesty top is Ulrika Schmidt, who is the Amnesty UK country coordinator, as we found out after the original broadcast? And if the woman is in the video is Ulrika Schmidt, can you confirm whether she will be asked to resign her position as Amnesty UK country coordinator? Fairly reasonable questions, I think, given the tone and the content of what was said there. Now, that was over a month ago. And I know from people in my Telegram channel that they were sending in comments to Amnesty asking for a response, and they were getting replied to within 24 hours. So this is obviously my message being escalated up the chain of command. And I finally received a message through from this woman, Kai Akram, who is the media and PR manager. She's been acting up as head of media since January 2024. She's the main point of contact for Europe's human rights issues for the UK press. And she sent me this message, which I'll read out in its entirety. I think it's important to get the whole thing across. So, dear Ben, thank you for contacting us. We issued the following statement on the 8th of August. Members and supporters of Amnesty UK attended yesterday's massive anti-racism rally in Walthamstow. The activist in the video has made clear to us that they were distracted and hadn't heard the speaker's comments when they applauded generally with the crowd. The speaker at the event is not affiliated with Amnesty, and we strongly oppose violence and any kind of hateful speech. So that's the boilerplate that was sent out at the time. On their website, I didn't see that on any of their main social media feeds, whether it's Twitter or LinkedIn or any of the other places where Amnesty UK publishes information. I didn't see that communication. They've just been sending it out on emails. That's really important. Distribution is absolutely critical here. Now let's continue. Going back to the letter here, we can see that in addition to the boilerplate response, they've added in a few extra items. So the woman in the video is Ulrika Schmidt, so that's been confirmed, who is a volunteer activist. She's not a member of Amnesty staff, right? Well, as I understand it, she is the UK country coordinator. So there's a bit of confusion here about what her role is and whether she has a formal position inside the organisation. Sounds like she does work with them, but she's not being paid by them. So maybe there's a bit of a grey area there. She goes on to say, Ulrika was subject to threats following the release of the video, which are of serious concern. You can find more information here. I agree, they are of serious concern. She shouldn't be being threatened. Nobody should be being threatened. That's the point of this. And we did report on that, actually, in a subsequent broadcast. And she then goes on to say Amnesty UK did not play a role in organising the rally. And then we have this statement at the end saying, we strongly oppose any kind of hateful speech, including the statements made by Ricky Jones on the 7th of August, which feels like a success to me, actually. It feels like a step in the right direction anyway, because they haven't actually formally distanced themselves at any point up to now from the statements made by Ricky Jones. And I think it's very important that they do that. But I don't think that this is anywhere near enough, to be quite honest with you. I think the first issue that I have is that this has taken a month to come to me, for a start. I mean, we're dealing with national security issues, let's be honest here. So that's not a quick enough turnaround time. It also hasn't come from the top, right? And Sasha Deshmukh knows where I live, right? He and I are connected on LinkedIn, and last week he actually viewed my profile on LinkedIn. It allows you to see that. So I know that he is engaged with the issue, and yet he's decided not to send the message himself. He sent it via his media communications team. I don't think that's good enough. As I said in my original letter to you, Sasha, if Amnesty are to maintain any level of credibility on this crucial issue of human rights, I think that you need to make a firm public statement, and we need action as soon as possible from yourself and the organisation, and not just in my inbox or on a PDF on a website somewhere where journalists can go and get it if they want to. This needs to come from your main communication channels, and it needs to be weaved throughout your entire communication strategy, because unfortunately for you, you're sitting right at the heart of very dangerous potential conflagration of ideologies and rhetoric that I believe presents a serious danger to national security and to the British people.
Ben, thank you very much for that. It will be fascinating to see what happens. Well done for challenging that particular organisation. Now, we'd like to say to our viewers and listeners that if you like what the UK column is doing, then please support us for £5 a month. You help keep this organisation going. We really want to expand the amount of material we cover and the number of people we can put in front of a camera. So we are there to get news and information out. We're there to support and protect people wherever they are in this country and indeed overseas where we can. And the truth and facts is the important weapon. So if you haven't joined us, £5 a month makes you part of the team. And we'd also like to say, please share our material. It goes out on Twitter accounts and BitChute and Telegram, but we are constantly aware that we are under covert censorship, if we call it that, and so for people to share our information, that's extremely important. You can also support us by purchasing from the UK column shop. And if you haven't had a look at the online shop, then please do visit. And we'd also like to encourage people to buy a copy of the Agenda 21 Your Life in Their Hands booklet. This has been an enormous success, but there are still copies available. If you haven't got one, please consider buying one. Now, tomorrow we've got the second part of the interview with Debbie Evans and Dr. Sabine Hazan. And that'll be going out at 1 o'clock. And Dr. Hazan will be talking about the gut and how important the gut is, and why gut feelings are important. So if you've seen part 1, I'm sure you want to see part 2. Let's just have a little look at a clip from part 2 to get a feel for what she's talking about.
And you can see the narrative, changing a little bit. When they started talking about the vaccine injured, now you start going, well, are they trying to use the vaccination to create chaos again, to make people panic, to blame, a political candidate? You could see the narrative. This is all this whole pandemic, all this about viruses and everything. Once you put healthcare in the limelight and it becomes about the price of a stock, then you've lost healthcare. That's it.
Okay, and in that clip, she's talking effectively about constraints that were put on her after she started to question COVID-19, which impacted on her own knowledge on gastroenterology. So do have a listen into that tomorrow. Now, our conference, UK Column on Location, Bristol, the 19th of October. Tickets are still available, but they're selling quickly. So if you haven't bought a ticket, please consider getting one. And a great range of speakers, and also the opportunity to meet and speak with the UK Column team themselves. We are really looking forward to it, and we hope you'll come and join us. Now, I'll just say that Mike Robinson and myself will be talking in small slots at the Heritage Party conference. That's Saturday the 28th. It's a ticketed event, and you can get details via the office at heritageparty.org. So have a look at that. And this is just one of the small parties that we are supporting. Now, back to the subject of Ukraine. And of course, one of the things that Ukraine is doing at the moment is sucking up huge sums of public money from the UK and other countries around the world. So this is gov.uk talking about the Defence Secretary welcoming the Ukrainian counterpart to UK and confirms £1 billion milestone in the UK-administered fund. But if we have a look in the text that goes with this article, we see that UK is now basically saying that there'll be £3 billion of UK aid for Ukraine per year for as long as it takes. This is the real agenda of Starmer's state. It's keeping that war going, but we get some idea of the sheer destruction by having a look at the World Bank financing. Now, this document is called Public Expenditures for Administrative Capacity Endurance, and that spells out peace. An irony here that basically loaning money at interest so that Ukraine is ultimately going to be drowning in debt, never mind the dead bodies. This is the good works of the World Bank, apparently. But in this document, we quickly start to understand how disastrous the state is in Ukraine. And basically, it becomes apparent that without without support from the World Bank and others, the war wouldn't keep running. But the World Bank describes its help as humanitarian support. But we've already shown in this news edition that ultimately the West wants to keep the war going for experimental means to learn more about the battlefield. I've got another paragraph here talking about the overwhelming scale of the problem for the Ukrainian government, and it says that Ukraine's financing needs reached 35.1% of GDP in 2022. It's far worse now, equivalent to $53.3 billion US. And in this section here, it actually talks about what the money is being used for that the World Bank is providing: government employees' salaries, school employees' salaries, tertiary education salaries, pensions, social assistance payments, IDP payments, child and family benefits, first responders' salaries. So this is what public money from the West is being used for. But of course, nobody wants to stop the war, which is causing the problem in the first place. And if we go on to key risks, well, the only thing we need to say is that the World Bank realizes that the whole Ukrainian debacle is so risky that it defines each risk as either high or substantial. Ben, at this point, let's bring you in because you've got information on Ukraine here. But this war truly appalling.
Indeed, it is. And something is happening in Ukraine. It's amazing. Brian says from time to time, regular viewers will have heard Brian say that it's amazing the coincidences that pop up, because we don't organise and coordinate ourselves ahead of the news. We just come through with the stuff that we think is interesting on any particular given day. And I was talking about and going to talk about the idea of Ukraine as a laboratory, but not for destruction, the war side of it, although it is certainly that, but more for reconstruction and actually what they're going to build in order to replace what they've destroyed. And these two things go hand in hand, and the same people are coordinating them, and the same people are making money out of them, actually, at the back end, as we'll get into. Now, I'm just going to start off by Starmer and his trip to DC last week to go and seek permission to use long-range missiles in direct attacks against the Russians. Incredibly, that was refused. I think everyone was caught by surprise with this, that Biden said that he didn't want to give us permission to use our missiles. I think that tells you something about the state of US and UK relationships. And actually, Biden did go rogue, not just there, he also went rogue elsewhere. So I think he's probably on a bit of a busman's holiday, or whatever you want to call it. He's not taking things very seriously at the moment, but he's still certainly front and centre in the way that this stuff is playing out today. And he's got a deep heritage with Ukraine, as I'll come on to in a moment. Let's just nip back to this photo of Starmer and his trip to DC. And actually, I'm less interested in Starmer right now and more in this woman in the background we can see here, who is Karen Pierce, DCMG, UK ambassador to the United States. Now, we sometimes hear this term deep state, people behind the scenes calling the shots who work across administrations who you don't vote for and you can't get rid of. Well, Karen Pierce certainly falls into that category for my money. We've got a couple of clips here that I'm just going to play from Karen Pierce speaking at Chatham House at the end of last year about American power.
It's overwhelmingly in our interest that America remains the leader on the world stage. That's not to deny China her place. It's not to say we have to have a unipolar world, but we have all benefited enormously from American leadership. And whoever wins in 2024, I think the one thing we should all be doing is urging no retreat in that leadership.
We've all benefited from American leadership. It's an interesting turn of phrase. And I don't think that she means from Biden or Obama necessarily, but actually from organizations like this, right? I mean, this is the American empire. She was talking at Chatham House there, but which is one of a number of secretive groups that sit above national governments, that call the shots, pull the strings. In this instance here, we can see the Bilderberg meetings where David Lammy attended last year, probably getting his marching orders to come out and promote further conflict in Ukraine, as we saw earlier in the show, but also the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, where Keir Starmer is a member. And how does Karen Pierce believe that this American empire should use its power? Let's go back to the clip from Chatham House.
America could use that power even more to champion open societies. There is a constituency there among the silent majority of the middle ground, so-called middle ground countries. We don't, I think, do enough to address their concerns about how they manage things like AI and a multi-sector public, private, civil society approach. And we could do more to help them with that.
So a multi-sector public, private, civil society approach is what's required. We've talked about public-private quite a bit. That's the technical definition of fascism. But she's added in civil society there. And that essentially means large philanthropic groups like the Open Societies Foundation, which is a term that she used at the start of that clip, which is an organization run by George Soros, which promotes open societies and a radical transformation of the West, as we've been talking about. And a lot of that centers on Ukraine, because the Open Societies Foundation at its core is built on this organization, the International Renaissance Foundation, which George Soros founded in Ukraine in 1990 as he was going around picking up the pieces of the former Soviet empire in order to build what he calls himself the Soros empire. And there was one person in particular who was very involved in that, and that is Biden, according to Soros himself. Biden is absolutely front and center in what has been happening in Ukraine. And what is happening in Ukraine? Well, we talked about the war, but there's also a reconstruction happening, and it is extraordinarily profound. We can see here Stephen Jensen, the country director for Ukraine at the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, describing this as the most important geopolitical event in the world since the end of the Cold War. He's not talking about the conflict. He's talking about the reconstruction. He's talking about building what the BlackRock CEO Larry Fink has described as a new world order. Right? This is language that's coming from the people running the system. What does that look like? Well, a lot of it's about digitization. So we can see here Mikhailo Fedorov, who is the Minister for Digital Transformation at Ukraine, saying that Ukraine 2030 will be the freest and most digital country in the world, without bureaucracy, but with a strong tech industry, cashless and paperless. This is the future world that we are building. And let's watch a short video describing that world in a bit more detail.
Let's look 8 years ahead. 2030. The history of the new Ukraine is studied all over the globe. Why? Because Ukraine became the most digital and convenient country in the world. Scripts have replaced bureaucrats. 500,000 former public servants are successfully integrated in the new economy. No more red tape, but paperless. No more banknotes, but cashless. Yes, we became the first country to abandon paper money. Ukraine now has the best tax system for the IT industry and the most affordable e-residency. Thanks to Ukrainian engineers and programmers, the R&D centers of the world's top technology companies operate successfully, and Ukraine ranks first in the world by the number of startups per capita. Ukrainian courts are guided by artificial intelligence, and all notarial acts take place online. Ukrainian customs is fully automatic and the fastest in the world. Customs clearance and car registration can now be done in 3 clicks from your smartphone. Because of war and internal migration, we have built the most flexible and modern digital education. Brave military and civilians get quality treatment with modern remote monitoring and e-health systems. Ukraine also has the most effective cyber defense in the world. After the horrors of 2022, Ukraine focused on security systems. Now every production facility has its air defense system, and the sleep of Ukrainians is protected by an ultra-modern iron dome. The Ukrainian government is digital, more like an IT company in terms of the efficiency of implementing decisions, and one can register a land plot, start construction, open a business or get a license, and register a car or real estate from a smartphone, automatically, in 1 click. Ukraine is the freest and digital. This is all because international partners and the world's leading technology companies supported the Digital for Freedom initiative and united to help Ukraine recover through digitalization. Building a new Ukraine together, free and the fastest, brave and digital.
So a total digital transformation of the country in order to replace the country that's been destroyed by the conflict. So many different components of that film that you could talk about. The ones that really jumped out at me, though, is that artificial intelligence replacing the court system. 500,000 former civil servants are going to be integrated into this new economy somehow, not particularly clear what that's going to look like. We're going to get rid of paper money. AI is going to be across education. This is a really fundamental transformation that ticks all the boxes for the global agenda that we've been hearing from the World Economic Forum and other places like that over the past few years, and that ultimately our own leaders are envisaging for the future of the UK and other countries around the world. And who's building it? Well, there's Fedorov. And by the way, Fedorov is really Zelensky's number 2. Zelensky, we hear about, he's obviously the president. He's out there banging the drum for the war and raising funds for the conflict. But the rebuild is being led by this guy. He's dealing with the UN. He's dealing with the World Economic Forum. They actually announced the first global GovTech technology center, which they're building together in the Ukraine. It's the first one outside of Germany. We're also heavily involved in this. We've also, as this is obviously a public-private partnership, got the big tech giants like Google in there. Amazon Web Services are helping with the rebuild. And also organizations like Yale, who we heard about earlier. Another coincidence. And I'm sure that Fedorov's going to be talking to this gentleman about the Great Transition. So a lot going on in Ukraine. And as I say, it is very much a laboratory where they are experimenting, as Brian said earlier, with tools for destruction but also at the same time calls for reconstruction and rebuilding a new system. Now, just as a final point, I want to draw everyone's attention to this tweet, which came from Sir Ephraim Myers, the chief rabbi of the UK, sending his condolences to the chief rabbi of Ukraine, who lost a son in the conflict. And there's an interesting phrase at the end, which I think people should be aware of, and maybe we could ask some questions about here. So he goes on to say, "My heart goes out to Chief Rabbi Moshe Asman, Rebbetzin Chana, and their family on the tragic loss of Matityahu, who was killed in combat as he defended Ukraine. Our thoughts are with Matityahu's wife and their young daughter. May his memory be a source of blessing to them, and may they be comforted among all the mourners of Zion." Now, what I was wondering is, does that make Ukraine part of the Zionist project?
That's a very good question, Ben, and there's lots to be discussed around that. I think time prevents us from doing that in today's news, but we can certainly cover a bit more in UK Column Extra in a few minutes. But before we close the news, Diane, let's bring you back. And just very briefly, have we got an opportunity to criticise what's going on as a member of the public or indeed an academic? Is there freedom of speech?
Has said definitely not. We did have one of the few good things that the Tories did was they got through Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023, which was supposed to kind of prevent these kinds of things from happening, to allow us to speak out without having to worry about lawsuits or getting in trouble in some other way. And so this was officially supposed to come into effect on the 1st of August, 2024. But I want to go back just to a quick video that happened with a debate in the Commons last week. There was a question raised to our Secretary of State to ask what assessment she has made of the adequacy of levels of academic freedom in higher education. So this is just the end of the debate, just one question and her answer.
In more detail.
Minister Gagan Mahindra.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome the Secretary of State to her place? The Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act 2023 would have ensured that universities in England have the tools they need to deal with interference and threats to freedom of speech and academic freedom wherever they originate. Now the Act will no longer be implemented by this government. Will the Secretary of State clarify to the House what her alternative plans are to protect academic freedom in the higher educational sector?
The Honourable Gentleman will know that freedom of expression and academic freedom are incredibly important. There are duties that the Office for Students sets out. Many of these principles are already enshrined in law. But I want to make sure that we get this right. And I'm confident that the Honourable Gentleman would not want to be in a position where the Act might have opened up the potential for hate speech, including Holocaust denial, to be spread on campus, something that the previous Minister in the last government was unable to rule out.
So leading up to that part of the debate, as well as the previous debate, if you go look at Hansard, we see that there is also questions around the relationship that has been raised. There's a Peking University HSBC Business School located in Oxford, just outside of the city of Oxford. It's part of the campus. And it's the first overseas campus of the UK, in the UK, from Peking University from China. And it states on their website, which you can see easily, that the core value of this university is of global vision and China insight. So there were questions raised before that, part of the debate around, is this because we have authoritarian control over a university that is now located as part of its campus here in the UK? And she kind of diverted the question by going back to the possibility of Holocaust denial being a reason for hate speech, and that's why she canceled the implementation of the legislation. So several academics, including the Academics for Academic Freedom group, which I'm a part of, as well as we now have the Students for Academic Freedom, which is great. We have several thousand of us now have signed this open letter to Bridget Phillipson, pointing out that we were very upset, obviously, to see that this has been canceled, and that a report published earlier this year by the Academic Freedom Index placed the UK 66th in the Global League table of academic freedom, lower than Peru, Burkina Faso, and Georgia, and many other countries. So no, Brian, no, we don't have academic freedom here, and we're not allowed to say anything about things that we don't necessarily agree with here in the Western culture any further.
Okay, Diane, thank you for that. Ben, thank you also for your segments today. We're in very, very troubled times. Clearly, freedom of speech is under major attack, and that's one of the reasons why we would say, if you like what the UK column does, then please support us with that monthly membership to help us not only keep going, but to expand and to challenge what seems to be in store for not only the UK as a nation state, but also for nation states worldwide. We'll end there. Thank you both for joining me. If you're a member of UK Column, stay on and we'll be back for extra in a few minutes. Other than that, we'll be back for Wednesday's news at 1 o'clock Wednesday. See you then. Bye-bye.